So hello, everybody, and welcome to the third and final of the webinars on the European Union, different aspects and issues of the European Union. And today we have a wonderful panel presentation on the subject of Russia's war with Ukraine and the European Union. What are the implications, the impacts of this war on the European Union? And to discuss this topic, we have three distinguished members of our panel. We have Melanie Moltmann. She's the Consul General of Germany to the Southeastern United States and based in Atlanta. Then Kaija Schilde. She's the Jean Monnet Chair in European Security and Defense and Associate Professor of International Relations at Boston University. And then Alasdair Young, the Neal Family Chair and Professor of International Affairs at Georgia Tech, and also the chair of the Center for European and Transatlantic Studies at Georgia Tech. Welcome again, and thank you to the panelists for agreeing to be here today, and we look very much forward to hearing what you have to say. So I don't know how we're going to proceed here, who's going to go first, but
Melanie's going to go first.
Okay, great.
And then Kaija, and then myself.
Okay, good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure for me to be with you here on the panel, and also good morning to you in the audience. I will share my brief first thoughts and talk a bit about the consequences the war in Ukraine had on Germany and Europe, especially also on the German security and energy policy. So this topic has been discussed a lot also in the press in the United States, of course, what this war in Ukraine has done to Europe. And I think Germany, as the biggest EU member country and the one with usually traditionally very close ties to Russia, has often been in the focus of it. So I perfectly remember when the war broke out. I was in Mobile in Alabama at that day, and it was something that we all had feared would happen. But I think in the end, most of us didn't really expect it to happen. This war really has massive consequences to Germany, to its foreign policy, and also to the German economy as a whole. So I thought already about some consequences, and which was really a thing that struck us most was the close economic ties Germany had with Russia. Germany has imported most of its energy resources from Russia, has been a big trading partner of Russia, and German investment in Russia has traditionally been very large. Also, of course, in other Eastern European countries or other former Soviet Union countries. So we are really very much intertwined with Russia and with the Russian economy. Not so much as maybe 10 years ago. So because over the past 10 years before the war broke out, about half of German companies at that point present has left Russia. So our ties in the economic sphere were losing a bit already when the war started in terms of investment, but we were very much dependent on Russian energy. I think when it comes to energy, there are two very important aspects that also have been discussed very much here in the United States. So one is Nord Stream 2. So this was a very difficult topic for Germany over the past years. Nord Stream 2, the second gas pipeline between Russia and Germany through the Baltic Sea. There's a so-called Nord Stream 1 that has been in operation for several years. So this was a topic that already before the war was very important. It was difficult topic between Germany and the United States. The United States very much opposed to it for most of its part, and it was a very difficult topic in Germany because really, yeah, you can say half of the population, half of the political parties didn't want the pipeline to be built and operated, and the other half supported it. And the other thing when it comes to energy is that Germany has had for the past years, but especially after we now have a new government since December last year, has very ambitious goals when it comes to renewable energies and independence on fossil fuels. So for us, for a couple of years ago, the decision has been taken that we should phase out of use of coal to gain energy, and for a certain period of time until we would be able to really get all our energy needs by renewable energies, we would rely more heavily on natural gas. So this natural gas has come to most of its part from Russia. So when the war broke out, about 55% of Germany's gas imports came from Russia. And we had about 30%, it differs between 20 and 40%, depending on the time of the year, depending on the months, of our energy supply, of our energy needs came from natural gas. So this is a huge independence. Now we have to see what we are doing with this. We had this really ambitious plans for renewable energy. And now when the war broke out, we had to decide what are we going to do. So of course, we now really are pushing even more harder to renewable energy. But we also have to see what are we doing now with this Russian natural gas that is no longer coming to Germany. At the moment, we are down to basically 0% of Russian gas supplies because most of it came through Nord Stream 1, the pipeline, but it hasn't been in use for, I think, about 2 months or so. And after, yeah, there was this explosions going on, it's no longer possible to use it anyway. Only one track of Nord Stream 2 would be possible to use. So now we are trying to even push more harder for renewable energies, but we also did was to, yeah, really use our old coal power plants, which we really wanted to abolish for a couple of more years, or at least at the moment. What we also will do, and the decision will be taken by the parliament soon, it has passed already the cabinet of ministers, is that we are going to use nuclear power plants longer than we had intended to. A couple of years ago, Germany had taken the decision to phase out of nuclear energy, and the last 3 power plants should have been closed down by the end of this year. And this has been a very difficult discussion in Germany, what to do with these power plants. But in the end, the decision has been taken that we are going to use the 3 last plants until the 15th of April next year, to bring us over the winter, so to say, because it's of course difficult to phase out of coal, to phase out of nuclear energy, and not having Russian natural gas anymore. So we are doing this for the winter. What we are also doing now is to build facilities for liquefied natural gas so that we can use it in Germany in the future. This is very important. We also really try to push for hydrogen. So it's a push in development. What we also do was, together with the European Union, to have a gas saving plan for the whole European Union for the next months to come. It says that we should save about 15% of energy we used before. At the moment, there are calculations in Germany that we are saving about 20%, but maybe we would need to save about 30% to come really in a good way over our winter and not harm really our economy. So energy policy is really important. What is also important is classical foreign policy, but also our national security. We now are in the process of developing the first national security strategy. I think for the US, this is something completely normal, but for Germany, this is special, and the Foreign Office is in the lead in developing it. And it's something so where we should have the first draft, I think, still in this year. And we now have to think how to do it. So we are going to focus probably really on the hard security issues. But we also would like to include issues that we think are important for our foreign policy as a whole, and also, when it comes for a longer period of time, then maybe the war might last. So it's climate issues, so climate questions will also be included in the national security strategy. So we really are now developing it, and we have to find a balance between getting it really focused enough and including all the issues that are important now. The security policy is insofar very important because the war in Ukraine really has shown to the broad population in Germany how important NATO is, how important the partnership with the United States is, and how important really a functioning army really is. So our chancellor had a speech in our parliament, and he described what we are going through now in our foreign and security policy as Zeitenwende, as a change of times. So it's really a shift in our foreign and security policy. And he developed and now we have developed a special fund where we would like to really bolster our armed forces with 200 billion euros. And there's also a firm commitment to finance the armed forces better for the year to come, in addition to this 200 billion special fund. We needed the special fund because Germany has something that is called a debt brake. So we are not allowed to make more debt usually. And the challenges we are now facing with the war in Ukraine, with high energy prices, and with really the need to bolster our security, we have to find ways to finance this all. For our foreign policy, apart from this Zeitenwende, I already mentioned that really everybody knows now that, I think most of people knew before, but everybody really recognizes how important it is to work even closer together with our partners, the partners we have, be it the partners in the European Union, or be it the partners here in the United States, for example. And so we have been working very closely to really bring balanced sanctions against Russia as a consequence of this war. So a couple of weeks after the war started, we had already 3 different sanction packages consented in the European Union. And on the 6th of October, there was the latest newest package of sanctions drafted as a reaction to the annexation of 4 Ukrainian regions to Russia. And we also very closely coordinated with the United States. And I really think this went very well. So probably a year ago, nobody really would have thought that this horrible war would really bring the European Union to function this well as it has now. So really that we can really unanimously pass all the sanctions. And then also, this is so closely aligned with what the United States are doing. A bit more to the European Union, what we do together, apart from the sanctions, and also, of course, apart from supporting Ukraine after the war. So we are supporting Ukraine bilaterally, but we are doing it also as members of the European Union, is that the European Commission has working on a set of recommendations how we can try to support our economies and to keep energy prices down. So there were some recommendations which some states already fulfilled. So they have a cap, for example, on energy prices. Germany decided on this only in the beginning of October. So we will have again a special fund to stabilize our economy with about 200 billion euros. That's a very big amount. But for example, caps to gas prices have already been introduced before in other European states, like in France and Spain, also in the Netherlands, in the Czech Republic, and in Austria. Not to that extent, but we try to do things here in line really with our European partners. And I think this is the point where I will stop. I hope there are questions, and I could also, of course, tell something about the broader economic consequences we have due to the war. Of course, as I said in the beginning, our economies have been very close in a lot of respects. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Melanie. I think we'll just handle all the questions at the end. Let the three panelists make their presentations, and then we can take questions from the viewers. But I guess we'll follow in the order of the names listed on the flyer, and that would mean Kaija Schilde is next. Kaija, if you want to take the screen.
Wonderful. Let me just set things up and make sure it's going on. Does that work? Fantastic, great. All right, my name is Kaija Schilde. I'm from Boston University, and I am going to specifically talk about the EU's military and strategic response to the Russian war on Ukraine. I just want to acknowledge that there are both, I could describe or talk about or answer in Q&A, both national level responses and EU level military responses. I think that the EU level military response is less well known, and it's more important to kind of talk about it. And so that's what I'll do. I'm going to give you the policy specifics of what the EU's military response so far has been, identify what the policies are, where they've come from, and then I want to situate that within two different theoretical frameworks. One is through the lens of European integration theory, and the other through the lens of the security studies debate about European strategic autonomy. And then I just want to finish with a few comments about whether this so what question, does this make a difference in terms of the strategic reality? So the reason I did slides is because I wanted to share something funny, which is helpful in such a detailed policy conversation. But in the past, the EU has had a reputation for not doing anything significant during foreign policy crises. And there's even a Twitter bot account that, in kind of dark humor way, automatically retweets any EU officials' statements about international security whenever they use the word concerned. And so it's, there we go. Here is a collection of the comments just from the last month. And so the Twitter account is a joke, but scrolling through it is a visual reminder of kind of the aggregate weight of this at least widespread perception that the EU has done little in response to international crises. Indeed, many people quote the foreign minister of Luxembourg, who said in 1991, when the Yugoslav Federation was breaking apart, he declared that this is the hour of Europe, not the hour of Americans, asserting that the European Union would take the lead role in addressing the Balkan conflicts and the new post-Cold War order. This was at best premature, and at worst reflected some kind of structural ability of the EU to respond to crisis, whether that's because of its design, its decision structure, its norms, or some other factors, but we can talk about that. So, with the beginning of the war in Ukraine, however, the EU went beyond deeply and very concerned. It, for the first time, has had a significant military response to an international crisis. There are three main aspects of this response so far. The first is direct lethal and non-lethal aid to Ukraine. The other is the deepening of already existing European defense integration. And the third is attempts to coordinate a wartime economy, which the Consul Moltmann was starting to talk about a little bit, these efforts at both the national level, but also the European level to coordinate. I also assume that Professor Young is probably going to talk about these economic measures more. And so I'll focus on the first two in terms of the response. So in terms of lethal and non-lethal aid, 4 days after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the EU pledged an initial 500 million euros in lethal aid, the direct supply of armaments to Ukraine. President Ursula von der Leyen announced that for the first time ever, the EU will finance the purchase and delivery of weapons and other equipment to a country that's under attack. Foreign Policy Chief Borrell said, another taboo has fallen, the taboo that the EU is not providing arms in a war. Yes, we are doing it. This war requires our engagement in order to support the Ukrainian army. I'll give one more quote before moving on, and that was Ukraine's foreign minister, Dmytro Kuleba, in May said, what we saw are some revolutionary, groundbreaking decisions taken by the European Union, which even they themselves did not expect to take. And we see NATO as an alliance, as an institution, sidelined and doing literally nothing. We'll get back to that later, not taking that at face value, but it's just, these are really strong statements. And so since February, the EU has updated this contribution amount 6 times in 6 different, or actually in 7 total different tranches, with the latest 500 million euro contribution coming just a few days ago, bringing the total contribution to about 3.1 billion euros. So this newest batch of aid is about 490 million for military equipment and about 10 million in non-lethal aid, such as personal protective equipment, first aid kits, and fuel. Also, there's an entirely different budget category just for post-sales services, for servicing logistics and equipment of already donated military equipment by EU member states. I couldn't quite track down the budget for that and find it. I tasked myself to do that this week and I ran out of time. But I just know from other military budget issues that maintenance and logistics are usually about 200% of the cost of the actual equipment themselves, if not more. So I would estimate billions more in that category, even though I'm not exactly sure what the funding vehicle is. So this 3.1 billion from the EU was really comparable to the initial 4.2 billion the US sent in military equipment, using just the executive authority of the presidency to transfer existing equipment from the US Armed Services. So this direct, I just want to put it in context there, for the initial contributions from the US and the EU were actually very comparable. So this direct arming of Ukraine by the EU comes under a vehicle called the European Peace Facility. So how does it work? It's actually not direct aid. It's somewhat indirect, but it's direct in terms of the decisions and decisions and regulations are coordinated at the EU level. That's the important thing I want to highlight. So the EFP is coordinated by the European External Action Service, the EEAS, which identifies equipment owned by member states, asks member states to send it, and then reimburses the member states for that equipment. And member states themselves are responsible for delivering the equipment directly. The EU doesn't have some kind of warehouse somewhere with tanks. That is not what I'm trying to characterize as the authority, but it's a regulatory authority and a decision level authority about this. So this is kind of a financial carrot to member states to give up their equipment and to transfer it to Ukraine. It has a total budget of $5 billion for 2021 to 2027. I'm going to close my window. There's obstruction. However, the EU will certainly increase this fund because nearly all of it's been spent at this point. Back when the original decision of 500 million euros was made back in February, one diplomat involved quoted in a newspaper saying, this is definitely all we can spend for this year, because they'd already spent 10% of the EFP, but they've now spent nearly all of it. So it'll probably be raised because it's not going to last until 2027. And then a few days ago, the EU announced another 107 million euro EU military assistance mission to train 15,000 Ukrainian soldiers, led by a French vice admiral, headquartered in Brussels, but operating in the territory of EU member states. So that kind of characterizes that direct aid. In addition, there's a deepening commitment to EU defense integration, which is already ongoing. Member states met in Versailles in March to talk about Russia's war of aggression. They committed the EU to more responsibility for our security and taking further decisive steps towards European sovereignty. This included bolstering defense capabilities, reducing energy dependencies, and building a robust economic base. The Commission was tasked with agenda setting around what deepening EU defense integration meant. And so far, they have come up with a common defense strategy, but even more significantly, a European defense industry reinforcement through Common Procurement Act, which is an effort to jointly develop equipment needed for both European and Ukrainian efforts. So the coordinating of wartime economy, I'll leave to my colleague, but I just want to say that this is also a strategic issue in terms of trade-offs that is partially and increasingly being coordinated at the EU level. So for example, energy is something that the Consul already talked about, but it's a massive issue, but the food issue is going to come back on the table because the agreement that let ships enter the Black Sea that was negotiated with Turkey and Russia and Ukraine in August is going to expire in mid-November. And so I'm going to just predict that that crisis will be even more intractable then, affecting food supply. So there's precedence here for coordinating things like wheat during war. It's what allies did in World War II in an interwar period and World War I. And indeed, the same people who did that ended up becoming fathers of European integration. People like Jean Monnet coordinated wheat supply during war and then coordinated the EU. So I can answer questions about that later. So what does this speak to in terms of conceptual frameworks? There's both, this question that I know some people in the room are talking about, people who think about the EU, we like to think about like what causes European integration, what leads to it, or this new military response, this European peace facility, how do we understand it within the theories we have of European integration? So a few more important facts about the European peace facility to help us situate it theoretically. First of all, it's an off-budget, off-books project, which sounds sketchy, but this is pretty common because it's not directly allowed by EU treaty. It's effectively an informal extra-legal agreement. It hasn't reached the codification of EU law, so it doesn't violate the treaty. It lives a little bit in a gray space. However, this is not new for the EU. This is how a lot of European integration unfolds empirically. There are decisions like the 1999 Saint-Malo agreement between the UK and France that later got uploaded to become common security and defense policy or European security and defense policy at that time. Same with the 1995 Schengen Agreement. It had been uploaded from other states and kind of took on a little bit of a life of its own. Indeed, the European Defense Agency that was created in 2003 happened a full 6 years before it was legal in the 2009 Lisbon Treaty, because it was supposed to be part of a defense package from the Constitutional Treaty, which had some speed bumps, in terms of vetoes and things like that. But the bureaucracy got deployed anyway. Another example of extra legal situations is direct arming of the 10,000 strong border and coast guard agency Frontex, which is not directly legal through EU treaty. So, these things exist. These things exist in the in-between space. I'm not trying to be anti-EU or anything here. I'm just trying to note them as processes to understand. Also, the European Peace Facility was not new. It was not created in 2022 as a result of the war. It was activated and adapted in 2022. It was actually created in March 2021. It had already given 31 million euros in non-lethal aid, such as medical equipment and mobility and cyber defense to Ukraine, and with other recipients such as Georgia, Moldova, Mali, and Mozambique. Most of the budget was supposed to be spent in sub-Saharan Africa, supporting peace operations in Somalia or against Boko Haram in the Lake Chad region. Indeed, it was even modeled and adapted from an African peace facility where the EU was trying to fund, trying to vehicle to fund African Union operations. So these things get adapted and modified and uploaded, and there's some structural pressure going on there. So even though the EFP was created in 2021 or modified in 2021, it is part of a package of policies such as PESCO and European Defense, the EDF, that were created in 2016 as a part of the global strategy and launched in 2017, all as a response to the Russian invasion of Crimea and involvement in the Donbass. So all of this exists. It's been modified, it's been shaped, it's a little extra legal. It goes from informal to formal. So there's something to pay attention to here. There's a phenomenon here that's bigger than this. It fits a set of phenomena. So it tells us something about how the EU integrates. The closest theory here is neo-functionalism, if anybody knows that one, but it doesn't really fit at all because there's no bottom-up pressures for the EU to do things. It's more that the institutions themselves, the effort themselves, generate pressures for more institutions. So the closest theories are actually institutionalist theories, like things that come from regime theory, international organization literature, or the comparative politics literature of state formation. They explain how institutions, like informal ones, like off-books arrangements, can generate their own logic for further institutionalization or pressure, and how these things can become formal over time, even without like constitutional moments from member states formally generating a lot of power. That kind of ends up just being the thing that happens at the end as almost a symbolic gesture. So there's also a specific kind of institutional change going on here, layering over time of these informal institutions that allow for a kind of capacity that gets aggregated. And when there is some kind of threat, allows the EU to act when needed. At this point, the EU has now had 2 decades of this layering of all these different defense efforts that most people have kind of laughed at or dismissed as failures or weak. But this is latent organizational capacity. Most of this authority is regulatory and involves markets and does not involve what you would call like armies of operational authority. But what's interesting here is that tells us something about the generation of force in the 21st century. So I know that I'm running low on time, but I just wanted to point to the strategic security studies debate here too. There's a lot of debate in especially international relations and security studies in the pages of journals about will there be European strategic autonomy in the case of abandonment by the US or NATO? And it's kind of a little bit of a quaint or provincial debate because it's amongst a lot of IR scholars in the United States who align with kind of a foreign policy grand strategy debate about whether to be more restrained or engaged in US foreign policy. So the people who are restrainers say that the United States, or the people who are engagers say that, Europe needs the United States' help and points to how it's weak. People who are restrainers say that Europe is strong on its own. However, in the debate in general, the EU is ignored entirely. There was a big article last year that claimed European states would never be able to mount a strategic autonomy response to Russia because they currently in the present underfund defense and don't share the exact threat perceptions of Russia. However, this article totally ignored the EU and indeed this infrastructural power of the EU, of this market and fiscal capacity to generate resources or respond to crises with Keynesian power, to create resources, to make the money printer go burr, to borrow, which, it has been incrementally happening. So no, the EU is not taking direct action, but neither is the US or other NATO states because any direct military confrontation would risk nuclear escalation. So the EU is behaving in a way that is very similar to all advanced states, even with more robust operational armed forces. So just my last slide is, so how does this matter? So yeah, I'm arguing that the EU is a latent security state in terms of its infrastructural institutional market power. It has all the resources it needs to generate military capacity. The question is this changing anything in Ukraine, and will it continue? Will it be enough to generate a response to a security crisis? So far, the response is pretty short term and ad hoc, and has produced new dilemmas, new integration dilemmas, and also military dilemmas. European states, just like the US, are depleted of military equipment. I don't want to make us all feel sorry for, defense organizations or bureaucracies here, but they are genuinely depleted, and they're turning to defense industry to generate more. And the United States, even though it initially had the same contribution as the EU in general, it has now outpaced through legislation about 4 times the military support for Ukraine as the EU. But there is absolute precedence here. The EU has infrastructural power to do the same. You can point to its COVID response around borrowing, such as the Next Gen EU program or the COVID relief packages that generated trillions of euros in monetary support. But the second effort here is the model of COVID relief efforts in terms of coordinating and controlling prices for supplying medical equipment and vaccine supplies to European states. Because what's going to be happening next is the defense industries are going to respond to this demand with price raises. And European states trying to both replenish their defense equipment and supply Ukraine are going to face a massive non-equilibrium problem in dealing with rising defense costs while they replenish. So that's the last word on it for now.
Okay, thank you, Kaija. Fascinating. Lots to chew on there. So next will be Alasdair Young, and after Alasdair's presentation, then we can open it up for questions.
Right, great. Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you for the 2 previous presentations. So what I'm going to do is I'm sort of going to give the economic parallel to Kaija's presentation, and likewise sort of put some of what Melanie talked about in the context of Germany in a broader European context. So I'm going to touch on the EU's adoption of sanctions, the energy and cost of living crises, which I sort of referred to as coordinating wartime economy. And I'm going to talk about the parallel, what the EU's done in terms of non-military support for Ukraine. And as with Kaija, I'm going to kind of end by sort of reflecting about what does this say about European integration and about the EU as an international actor, and this might provoke some discussion. Now, as both presenters have underlined, the EU's performance in this crisis has been really pretty good and surprising. Is certainly better than I had anticipated. And in the context of sanctions, it's particularly important to recognize that it's harder for the EU to adopt sanctions than for the US. And as Melanie alluded to, the sanctions must be adopted unanimously by all of the member states. Or in the United States, the president can adopt sanctions by executive order. The other thing is that Europe is much more economically intertwined with Russia than is the US. That means it has more potent levers to use against Russia, but it also means that using those levers imposes greater costs on the Europeans. That said, the EU has imposed an impressive array of sanctions, even if they are less extensive than the American ones, and even if there are loopholes or delays to mitigate the adverse effects on individual EU member states. This week, the New York Times reported that about 1/3 of EU exports to Russia by value and 2/3 of imports by value have been banned, which is really quite remarkable. And as I'll discuss in a moment, the EU has incurred significant economic costs by imposing these sanctions. That said, as Melanie mentioned, earlier this month, the member states agreed an 8th round of sanctions. And now the EU's resolve in this matter has been in response to the egregiousness of Russia's invasion and its subsequent actions. Right? Kaija referred to expectations that the EU would have trouble acting decisively because of different threat perceptions about Russia, but the invasion of Ukraine was such that it caused those threat perceptions to fundamentally change, as Melanie alluded to. Now, amongst the EU's sanctions, what are especially important have been moves to reduce Russian petroleum exports, as these are particularly valuable as a source of revenue for the Russian government. In June, the European Council agreed to ban almost 90% of Russian crude oil imports by the end of February and refined petroleum by the end of February. And to date, the EU has cut its imports almost in half from its pre-war levels. As part of that 8th sanctions package in October, the member states agreed to introduce legislation that will prohibit EU companies from transporting or facilitating the transport of Russian oil to third countries unless that oil was sold at or below a price cap. And as Melanie alluded to, in August, the Council adopted a regulation on reducing natural gas demand by 15% this winter. And this is more driven by a desire to reduce reliance on Russia, which Melanie talked about, than as an effort to impose costs on Russia. Now, this is a voluntary target, but there is a mechanism whereby the Council can impose mandatory reductions if necessary. Well, too far. Whether it's voluntary or not, the EU's member states have shifted considerably away from Russia as a source of supply of natural gas. Melanie talked about the tension, the drivers for increasing the use of natural gas as part of the energy transition. They talked about how German imports have fallen to zero in part because of Russia's actions. But now for the EU as a whole, Russia's exports to the EU are down 48% in the first 8 months of 2022, though the revenue has more than doubled because of the high prices. Import of oil from Russia in October was 14% of what it was in the 2016 to 2020. Liquefied natural gas imports to the EU are more than 90% higher. So there's been a major reorientation of the EU's energy mix, and that has come at a cost, right? And energy prices are a major issue in the EU at the moment. The prices began rising in Europe last fall, right, before the Russian invasion, in part because of increased demand as the COVID-19 pandemic eased. And as my colleague Adam Stolberg argued in his presentation last week, Europe's moves to curb Russian energy imports caused Russia to realize that its energy-related leverage had a very short life expectancy, shorter than it had thought, given the EU's planned energy transition that Melanie referred to. In response to seeing its leverage eroded, Russia sought to apply pressure by cutting off exports even more rapidly. And so we've heard restrictions through Nord Stream 1. So Russian gas exports to the EU are about 2/3 lower than they were. So you have the EU's moves to reduce dependence on Russia in the near term, and Russia moves to impose costs in the even shorter term have led to an increase in energy prices. Now, while petroleum is particularly valuable to Russia, natural gas is particularly important to the EU because it is hard to source from elsewhere, because much of it is delivered by pipeline, and Europe's capacity to regasify liquid natural gas is limited. Natural gas is also important because it is used for heating as well as for generating electricity and is directly used by industry. Now, in Europe, the price paid for electricity by consumers is determined by the cost of the most expensive feedstock, which at the moment is natural gas, right? So which is causing electricity prices in Europe to rise. And that's compounded by the fact that half of France's nuclear power capacity is offline for maintenance. The droughts during the summer reduce the sources of hydroelectric power. So there's a whole bunch of factors that are driving up energy prices. And these prices have been a major contribution to inflation. Right, so in August, energy costs accounted for nearly 4 percentage points of the price increase in the EU in the whole. So about half of European inflation is due to energy prices. Food prices, which Kaija alluded to, have also been pushing up inflation. Right? So the member states are confronted with a situation where they're trying to have a trade-off between a cost of living crisis now and a security of supply crisis later, right? Later meaning this winter when natural gas demand goes up to heat homes and offices. And so the governments have been seeking to increase their gas reserves, particularly to ensure there's enough gas for heating during the winter, but that pushes up demand, raising prices in the short term. As of the beginning of this month, gas storage facility capacity was almost 90% full, which was equivalent of a quarter of Europe's annual gas consumption. On the other hand, higher prices, which contribute to the cost of living crisis, suppress demand, which reduces the risk of a supply crisis. So you have this tension that governments are trying to manage at the moment. So earlier this week, the Commission advanced a raft of proposals to address the energy price crisis, including proposals for a joint purchasing of 15% of member states' gas demand for 2023, to enable the EU to use its market power to negotiate lower prices and to stop member states from bidding against each other and thus pushing up prices. It also proposed allowing the Commission to intervene in markets to set a maximum dynamic price at which gas transactions can take place on the Dutch title transfer facility, which is the benchmark for gas traded in the EU. This is meant to be a temporary measure and is only meant to be as a last resort. But the view is to establish a new pricing benchmark for liquid natural gas to replace that Dutch title transfer facility by March. The Commission's also proposed creating a default solidarity agreements, which are intended to ensure that member states facing a gas supply shortage will receive gas from others in exchange for fair competition. These measures are being discussed by the European Council, which is beginning to meet today. And as Melanie alluded to, there are other concerns with the response to the gas crisis, and particularly what it means for Europe's commitment to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. As Melanie mentioned, countries have turned to, or at least delayed, the shift away from coal. You've also have concerns that the rapid build out of natural gas capacity in the short run will make it harder to shift away in the longer run, given that the infrastructure costs will have been sunk. On the other hand, there's an argument that the high cost of natural gas, which is expected for quite a while, will create a greater emphasis, and the greater emphasis on security of supply will make renewable sources of energy more attractive. It's also worth noting that the natural gas price in Europe today is about a third of what it was at its peak in August, even if it's still 25% higher than it was a year ago. So there may be signs that some of the crisis is easing. Now, the member states have responded to the cost of living crisis through a range of measures, including reducing energy taxes and levies, regulating retail or wholesale prices, making transfers to consumers or businesses. And as this graphic indicates, the capacity of member states to address this crisis varies widely. And is even more striking given that this graphic predates the additional 200 billion euro funding that Melanie mentioned the German government has just decided to spend to address the crisis. Now, there are discussions about the EU issuing collective debt, as it did in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, to help address this crisis, particularly in those member states with fewer resources. France and Italy in particular have been backing the idea, and there's some support in the European Parliament. The German government and the Dutch government are unenthusiastic, and the Commission itself seems to be divided on the issue, with Thierry Breton, Commissioner for the Internal Market, and Paolo Gentilini, Commissioner for the Economy, being in favor, but Vladis Dombrovskis, the executive vice president for the economy that works for people, being against. On Tuesday, the Commission proposed allowing member states to redeploy up to 40 billion euros in EU regional and structural funds allocated under the previous budget to shelter vulnerable households and small and medium-sized industries. What's interesting is that thus far, the cost of living crisis does not seem to have been politicized in the sense of creating opposition to the sanctions, with the notable exception of Hungary's Viktor Orban, who blames EU sanctions for high energy prices. Rather, the cost of living crisis has created pressure through strikes and demonstrations for higher wages and for action to conserve current prices, but not for a change in policy. Now, the perceived unfairness of energy companies reaping massive profits while ordinary people struggle to heat their homes is a particularly politically toxic, but it does not seem as though the cost of living crisis will undermine support for Ukraine. As Kaija talked about the EU's military assistance to Ukraine, the EU has also been providing non-financial aid, but again, as with military aid, Europe thus far has been considerably less generous in supporting Ukraine financially than has the US. At the European Council in Prague earlier this month, the EU agreed to provide an additional 2 billion euros previously pledged by the end of 22, and an aspiration to provide 1.5 billion euros a month to Ukraine in 2023, which is in line with the US pledge of $1.5 billion a month. One area where the EU has made a major contribution has been in terms of hosting Ukrainian refugees. In October, the UN Commissioner for Refugees reported that about 5 million Ukrainian refugees were in the EU. 90% of them are women and children. Most of those have registered for the EU's temporary protection scheme, which conveys the right to work, to healthcare, to education, to shelter, and to financial support for up to 3 years. This is a very generous response and is markedly more so than the EU's response to non-Christian and non-white refugees. What does this leave for where the EU might be going? So one question is whether or not, in terms of whether the energy and cost of living crises will lead to closer integration, be another example of the EU failing forward, where a crisis creates new pressures for cooperation that move the EU forward. It's too early to say. It depends a lot on how the member states view the Commission's proposals and how much they want to situate them within the EU's institutional structure. And as Kaija alluded to, the EU often responds to these kinds of situations by creating almost off-book solutions. It did this in response to the COVID-19. It did it to an extent with respect to the Eurozone crisis. So the question is a question about whether or not this response will be brought within the EU framework. The other thing is that while the EU's response to the war has been impressive, the war itself is illustrative of a failure of the EU's policy of using economic entanglement as a source of influence to shape other parties. Right? It's the liberal idea that economic exchange leads to peace and political liberalization has been thoroughly debunked. But the EU does not really have a foreign policy tool other than economic engagement, which raises a question about how the EU is going to engage with the world going forward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Alasdair, and all of the panelists. So now we'll open it up for questions. If you're participating as a member of the EU Studies Program faculty, then you can ask questions directly using your microphone. That would be Brian Smith and the other Michael Bond there. I'm not sure who that is. If you're attending otherwise, you can ask questions using the question and answer function. I'll just begin then while we're collecting questions, and I'll just begin by asking, I have a very specific question for Kaija and then a more general question for I guess, for all three of the panelists. But for Kaija, my question concerns how the European Peace Facility is funded. Where does that money come from exactly? It's not part of the regular EU budget, but how is that revenue raised? And then the general question that all of you can pitch in on if you'd like, concerns the impact of the United States elections in November on EU assistance for Ukraine. Some concern, especially after Kevin McCarthy, possibly the next leader of the House of Representatives after the elections, has said that there's some pushback against continuing generous U.S. Support for Ukraine. And if the Republicans gain control of the House of Representatives, then it could be more difficult for the Biden administration to continue to funding the Ukrainians. And so there's some concern, if that's the case, if the U.S. pulls back, that this will put even more pressure on Europe to step up and to increase their support for Ukraine in different ways. So what are your thoughts about this possibility? So I'll stop there. I guess, Kaija, the first question concerning
Sure.
where the European Peace Facility comes from.
Sure. So when I say off budget, I'm not trying to make it sound so shadowy or informal that it's some secret conspiracy or anything. I mean, it is directly funded by member states. It has been agreed to as a part of former Athena mechanism, former African Peace Facility mechanism, as part of a general CSDP EAS mechanism. When I mean off budget, it's like a more informal part of the budget that can be pulled back or raised. It is not through community method or anything like that. It is more of a kind of, I would call it an informal institution or a trial institution what I wanted to point to is just how common this is in European integration. They don't all become formal EU policies, but it is an understudied aspect of European integration. So yes, it is funded legally by member states, but it is not constitutionalized at the EU level, if that makes sense.
Okay, so this is money that comes from the EU budget. It's just allocated for different purposes. It's not new funding that member states contribute, or that this is part of the 7-year budget that's approved every.
No, it's the latter. It's what you were saying. It's a separate, I would say, like almost like a pilot project, in that way.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. And yeah, if anybody wants to speak to my second question about what the impact of the U.S. elections might be on the European Union's assistance for Ukraine.
I'll take a first off it. I mean, I suppose that the big question is whether the U.S. does become less generous, and it was. Then McCarthy's comments were in the form of no more blank checks. That does so, which kind of could just mean won't be an open-ended commitment, but it doesn't necessarily mean there would be no additional funding. And I think it's pretty obvious that if the U.S. support were to diminish, it would create more pressure on the Europeans, to provide funding. What the capacity to do that is another story.
If I might add, it will definitely put higher pressure on us, on the Europeans, because I think support for Ukraine for Ukrainians is really vital. It's vital not only for this coming months, but for a longer period of time. And I mean, we are also already thinking ahead. So there are already discussions going on, negotiations on reconstruction funds, on financing that. So I think Europe is very committed to supporting Ukraine. How much we can manage, this might be really the question, but I'm very positive that we try the best we can, because really support for Ukraine, at least in Germany, is not not questioned. So the support for Ukraine, for really helping in a humanitarian way, military way, it's really big. The problem is that we have this unanimous decision-making process in Europe, and there might come a time when it's difficult to get unanimous decisions. I've worked in a previous occupation 3 years from our ministry, also in Brussels. So I was at a negotiation table when it came to visa policy and migration, and it was sometimes very difficult to really get everybody on board. And when it's politicized, yeah, like for example, Hungary used its influence in migration questions to veto decisions, then we will have a problem.
Still waiting for questions. So please, if you have anything you'd like to ask the panelists, please submit your questions using the Q&A function. I guess I have another one in the meantime, though, and this one's directed to Melanie, and this concerns there is criticism out there about Germany and some of its recent actions and decisions that many people view as being motivated purely by German national interest, but without taking into concern the interests of other EU countries or the EU as a whole. So criticism basically of German unilateralism, and we hear this in connection with the announcement of the 200 billion euro subsidy plan for energy, the reluctance of Germany to agree to new borrowing to finance various measures, new EU borrowing, Germany's blocking of a energy price cap at the EU level, various measures that or stances that Germany has taken that many people view as being inconsiderate of the broader EU interests and more focused narrowly on the German national interest. And of course, the background to all this is many people expect Germany as the largest country in the EU and the most important economy to step up to the plate and play more of a leadership role in the EU. So I just want to get your ideas or thoughts whether you think this is a fair criticism or yeah, it's something that needs to be dealt with.
It's a difficult question because on the other hand, you have the demand really that Germany steps up and take a leadership role. On the other hand, there are also the voices that say, well, Germany shouldn't step up, and there's still mistrust against Germany and mistrust against Germany taking a stronger position. I think Germany is not really blocking the price cap, so we are not. But of course, the 200 billion package now is larger than the ones the other European member states really had. It also comes later. I would say it's always a problem that how to sell things. So we are by far the most populous state in the European Union. So I think this 200 billion package is not really far off, not so much out of comparison to what other member states are doing. The discussion with common debt is a very long one. So we have had this discussion for years, and there have always been two parties in the European Union, two groups of countries that were for or against it. And I think we haven't been so drastically opposing it over the past, I guess, say 1 or 2 years as some other member states. But this is, clearly something we have to consider. So I think Germany has moved from a very staunch conservative fiscal position that it had a couple of years ago So I think we moved already from this one a couple, maybe 2 or 3 years ago. So we are not so much opposed in common responsibility. But I know that this discussion is still going on. I don't have any details right now, how much we would like to borrow and how many, and how could we do this? How can we really achieve this? And but this has been a discussion that has been going on for a lot of years.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, difficult discussions, I know. So we have some questions.
May I just read, especially with COVID. So I think with COVID, Germany really was a country that has moved away from its former very staunch position. So, and this was not an easy thing to do. So I'm not really sure how this discussion will unfold now over the coming years.
Thank you. So we have some questions. And this one goes to Kaija, and it asks her if she agrees with Alasdair that the EU does not really have a foreign policy tool other than economic engagement.
So yeah, I absolutely agree with Alasdair's presentation and the way he framed it. I'm going to take it like a good professor would and reframe the question and say, what foreign policy tools do states have, if not economic? I think that the military power can't be assessed without looking at economic power behind it. There is almost no such thing as thinking about military power in a vacuum without economic power behind it. So yes, I agree that the EU's main foreign policy tools are economic. But that doesn't mean that we immediately go into the do sanctions work or not debate. EU treaty law prevents the EU from waging violence, but it does not prevent it from generating the tools of violence. And so in that way, it already mostly represents, at least in terms of structural authority, what other states can do. Because there isn't even a conversation in other states like the United States or Canada or other European nation states about actual military action. Why? Because in this particular situation, it is a nuclear deterrent situation. Nobody is talking about military action. Everyone is talking about what economic tools they can deploy. So I just kind of aggressively push back, not because I want the EU to be something, because I observe it as very similar in terms of its latent resources and power about what is security in the 21st century. It's generally generating the resources of the tools of violence, not necessarily using it. So yes, I completely agree with Alasdair, but I pull back and say, and ask a bigger picture question.
So can I respond?
Okay.
So I mean, what I was meaning about this is, I think this is, the EU's primary way of engaging with the world was through trade. And we'd already begun to see the EU realizing the limits of liberalization and economic engagement and bringing China, the whole idea of bringing China into the world economy, the US, everybody thought this was going to help to bring about economic and political change within China. The US came to the realization earlier than Europe that that was not happening, but we began to see, the EU beginning to realize the limits of that kind of engagement. And then with, part of the strategy with respect to Russia, particularly German strategy with respect to Russia, was the view that being economically intertwined would discourage aggression. And so I'm not saying that, my point was not that the EU should be using other tools, but that it relied overwhelmingly on this one tool. And in the past couple of years, the utility of that tool has been demonstrated to not exist. And so then the question is, what other means will the EU have for engaging with the wider world? So that's
Okay, great. And by the way, that question was asked by Vicky Birchfield, so I just wanted to give her credit for asking a provocative question there and getting the discussion going. I think Melanie, did you want to say something too?
Yeah, just one thought that came to my mind. I mean, of course, we are now talking about security and economics, but I think what we should all not underestimate is also cultural and academic exchange. So if when this war will be over, we also have to think, how do we engage with younger generation, for example, in Russia, but also we should think about how do we engage with people in other countries, where we might have a problem with influence, like with China. So what would we like to do to support civil society, or how would we like to bring professors or students over to really engage with our societies, with our way of thinking, with democracy. So this is, of course, not something really so concrete, like economy, but I think this is a very important tool we have and that we should use more.
You're exactly right. And in fact, the EU has done a good bit in this regard. And I should mention at this point that this webinar series is funded actually by the European Commission, the Erasmus Plus program. So this is an example of maybe cultural influence and Kaija's position as Jean Monnet chair as well. So here we have an example of the EU engaging in this type of diplomacy already. Tony didn't ask a question, but his comment basically backs up what I think we've been talking about here. He says in the past, EU military integration has been more difficult to achieve than economic integration, and that's certainly true, and it may explain why the EU, among other reasons, is less reliant on military or traditional security tools than economic ones. But the next question is also directed at Kaija from all of the errands, and he asks, you mentioned that EU military support for Ukraine is 3.1 billion euros, but what about the individual member states? Are their contributions covered by the EU? And how much extra do the member states contribute beyond what the EU contributes as an organization?
Great. Actually, Alasdair had a slide about that. If you want to bring it up, I don't know. I don't have it as part of my presentation, but you do. To answer the question about what member states.
Yeah. Okay, give me a moment to find it again.
Yeah, and then at that, I'll also engage Tony's comment then while Alasdair's looking at that slide. I would push back that defense integration has been harder to achieve than economic integration. And you can tell that I push back on a lot of things. In the early 1950s, while right after European militaries had been annihilating each other and everything was in rubble, you had the creation of a European defense community. It ended up failing, but it became formalized. And so the question is, what do you mean by success or fail? Do you mean sustain? Do you mean start something? Because if you look at one version of history, the EU integrated defense before it integrated common markets. And then that fell apart for a lot of different reasons, mostly phenomena in the French Parliament, and it's just the different little political reasons why it fell apart. But states agreed to it. And so I would push back that defense has been automatically, defense is conceptually harder than civilian areas. And also the empirical record is that there have been earlier attempts to relatively successful for a period of time and then not successful. So the question is, what do you mean by successful? Does something have to last for decades to be successful? Or would you say that coming together to create a common European army within 5 years of the end of World War II is kind of wild, actually, in terms of ambitious? So.
Yeah, Alasdair, do you want to comment on your chart?
Well, I mean, the question was about military aid, but I don't know if there's much to add on this, but clearly the individual member states are providing aid, and some are providing a lot in terms of their GDP. Not surprisingly, the Baltic, the far, the ones in the Baltics, Poland and Czech Republic, Slovakia, standing out in particular in terms of the generosity of their contributions.
Okay. Let's see. Couple of questions that concern the ability of the EU with its diversity of interests and opinions among the member states to make decisions. Dick Plunkett asks, what is the trade-off between the growing number of members of the EU and the difficulty of reaching consensus among a larger number of members with a wide diversity of opinions? And this is somewhat related to Diane Katsaris's question with the election in Italy of a presumptive new prime minister, Giorgia Meloni. How do you see Italy's role changing vis-a-vis its support for the EU support for Ukraine, and how does it matter? I guess we could throw in there also Hungary and Viktor Orban, and whether his government's going to continue to support sanctions. And so basically the two questions together ask, is the EU going to be able to hold together when it comes to a united front on sanctions and support for Ukraine, given the diversity of opinion and views among its member states? So I guess I'll throw that out there for anybody that wants to take a crack at it.
Shall I start? And I think, obviously having, the more actors there are, more complicated decision-making gets, and the more diverse, the preferences are or perceptions of risk are, so that complicates decision-making. And I think there are a couple of things that are interesting in the specific questions. So one is, with Hungary, Orban spends all of his time complaining about the sanctions, and he's done this going back to the sanctions after the annexation of Crimea, but Hungary's never blocked the sanctions. They've negotiated things on the petroleum, but he's never actually, and that was very much in Hungary's narrow interest rather than that was an economic interest rather than some sort of foreign policy thing. So I think there's a little bit with Orban playing both sides against the middle, and I think it's interesting in the context of Italy. There's the story today about Meloni basically slapping down Berlusconi over his recent comments about what a great mate he is of Putin's, and citing Russian talking points on Ukraine. And there's even suggestions that she's basically trying to split his party and have him and if you look at the results from the Italian election, the brothers of Italy won at the expense of Forza Italia and the Lega. They both of which lost a lot of support from the previous election. So then she is quite committed to Ukraine. So it depends what the government ends up looking like, but it's not obvious that Italy will not exercise the same kind of leadership as it did under Draghi, but at the same time, it's not obvious that Italy's position on supporting Ukraine will change, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, I must say I'm also quite optimistic, because in the end, over the past years there have been very different and many different Italian governments, and what we have heard in an election campaign and what the actual policies then were in Brussels, this is a big difference. So I think Italy has always very constructively worked together with the other member states, and I think this will stay the same. And well, of course, but we have to see how really Europe will get through the winter. So our economic data is really bad already. So the inflation is higher than in the US. Growth is lower, so we will get into recession, most of it, especially also Germany. And then we have to see how really support might change. But in the moment, really, I think the population of the whole EU is really not taking, well, you have to see what is the reason for the crisis and who really causes it, so that we don't say, well, it's the high energy prices and it's the sanction that causes the difficulties. It's really Putin's war. It's really Russia's war that caused this all. And I think at the moment, this conception still holds. And how to cope with more member states and getting unanimous decisions. This is also a topic that has been debated for a long time. Should we have more majority decisions? We have already majority decisions also in the European Union. And before an enlargement of the European Union, there's always been the debate, oh, maybe we should change our mode of decision making to make it easier to get more decision making. And I think this is something that will continue over the next years.
I was just going to add to that, I'm so glad that Melanie brought up majority decision making, because some of these policies that we're talking about, like sanctions, require unanimous decision making. And so that is an open question here. But some of the policies we've been talking about, like joint military procurement, right now don't require unanimous decision making. And so some of these things would continue to proceed along their own logic, even if there was less agreement politically, or even if there were more effective anti-system kind of responses on the part of political parties gaining power. But I was just going to emphasize Alasdair's point that they haven't yet been able to really harness this opposition from rhetoric to reality. I mean, at least in terms of Orban in Hungary and the kind of pro-Russia perspective, being able to stop things. I mean, I know it's a friction, but so far that hasn't happened. But I would also say, as I warn my students, European democracies are much more responsive to public opinion by design than the American democracy, meaning that they are more vulnerable to, I mean, I know that every country has its own procedures for calling elections, but in general, compared to the United States, you can take down governments, in a shorter period of time than you can in the United States if the population is angry about things like inflation or food prices or energy prices. So how this is managed will determine whether or not this is a widespread thing that involves more powerful member states and core European powers. And so that's what I would watch.
Yeah, and I would just add regarding the situation this winter that could make it even worse is the possibility now, the way Russia's bombing infrastructure in Ukraine, that you could have a new wave of refugees from Ukraine because of the lack of energy and heating for homes and so forth in Ukraine. So this could add even more pressure to the situation. I want to get to Adam Stolberg's question. He has a good one, I think. He asks, what are the knock-on effects of Russia's war in Ukraine for the EU's assertiveness when it comes to blunting Chinese encroachment, such as economic and infrastructural spending across Europe and its former Soviet periphery? And I guess I would add to that also, maybe what kind of lessons has the European Union learned from its dependence on Russian energy when it comes to dependence on Chinese products or Chinese-based supply chains going forward? Is there going to be a lesson that is drawn from the Russia experience that might apply to China? So here again, this is directed to any of the panelists that want to answer it.
Should I take the first swing again? I don't want to be almost. I mean, I have to say I haven't really been focusing on. I mean, I think I haven't really been focusing on the EU's reaction to China. I mean, there was already a move away from enthusiasm about the Belt and Road Initiative, driven in part by European frustration about the benefits. It was not seen as beneficial as they had thought, and their concerns about the debt entrapment. And you also saw the EU European member states, in particular, getting more concerned about Chinese economic activity. So you had the adoption of investment screening rules. So you already saw a degree of skepticism about Chinese economic involvement, and I can't remember the details of it, but like the US, the EU has a sort of counter BRI investment fund for funding infrastructure projects. And in terms of the supply chain issue, I think there's a general concern, and it's not just by governments, by companies as well, as about being exposed to supply chains that are reliant upon authoritarian regimes, which are no longer seen as reliable as they once were. So I think and this has come up in the context of a concern about reliance on rare earths from China. What I've seen less of is a concern about the reliability of those as markets for destinations of good, because that's another form of dependence. And if you're relying on those markets to buy your goods, which is a particular issue for Germany, which has a lot of, I think it's 3% of GDP is exports to China. So there's that vulnerability as well, not just in terms of supply, but also of demand.
I'll add to that to say that it's hard to say right now, because I think it'll take one of two paths. There were already, if the path continues that was already set in the last couple of years, like Alasdair was just saying, it is in a more geopolitical, strategic concerns about supply chains. The Commission and a lot of the discourse around European strategic autonomy has not just been about NATO, but it's also been about concerns about supply chains and China specifically. And so things have already been happening, like the Commission proposed a CHIPS Act, very similar to what just got implemented in the United States, about incentivizing kind of industrial policy over semiconductors and chips to have more digital sovereignty. So this is a large package about concerns about sovereignty that go beyond maybe traditional military concerns to weaponized supply chains, or concerned about weaponized supply chains. However, I would just watch for what else becomes weaponized, in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, like in terms of energy, food, and things like that. And there may be a temporary or period, just like German coal supply being relied on temporarily. There may be temporarily a more reliance on China, depending on what gets weaponized.
I would also like to add, because I think that European companies and also governments, but especially also German ones, they're becoming more cautious. And also when it comes to huge investments of China in the EU. So China has invested a lot in the Western Balkans, and it has also invested a lot strategically in several countries. For example, the port, the harbor of Piraeus in Greece. And so for example, at the moment, China would like to buy shares in the port of Hamburg in Germany. And until now, this has been blocked. So, and we also had some time ago a discussion whether China should be allowed to take part in the 5G network in Germany, and that has been blocked. On the other hand, some German companies are so heavily involved in China that they just can't really pull out. So, but I think they are more careful, and they are changing their strategy. And we see it here that really there's more and more investment coming also to the United States, more and more investment coming to other European countries, because companies would like to, just cooperate more closely with more reliable partners. So this is something I say we would see over the next years, that we are really trying to come closer in our transatlantic partnership. And really companies are flooding to the US, I have this feeling. It's just a feeling, but I think they're coming in larger numbers.
Well, on that possibly positive note, I think we need to end it. We're about out of time. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all the questions. There were some other excellent ones asked, but I want to thank our three panelists for their insights and expertise today, and the great discussion that we've had. Thank you, everybody that attended, and for asking questions in particular. And I also want to end by thanking Alasdair Young once again for basically organizing this three-part webinar series for the European Union Studies program. And thank him for his efforts in that regard, and also Chris McDermott, who's provided valuable technical assistance here as well. So thanks, everybody, and hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.